Hello, everybody. We are live. Hello, Kate.
Hi, how's it going, Mike?
Welcome back. Episode 4, our last episode.
Yeah, good to see you. Good to see
Good to
you.
see you too. Yeah, welcome everybody to our last episode of Is God Funky or What? And it's so good to be here.
Indeed, indeed. And this, of course, is a sad moment for Mike and I. We've really enjoyed this broadcast, but as we know, all good things must come to an end. But hopefully, it won't be the end for good, in the sense that Mike and I hope to perhaps do something on campus once the pandemic ends, in a similar vein to what we've been doing in this broadcast. So stay tuned. We may have
Absolutely.
more to share about that. But I
Absolutely.
just also wanted to iterate a good evening and thank you for joining us for, again, our last installment for a series of Is God Funky or What? And so the dynamics of power, music, and Black healing is the subtitle. And it's inspired by Dr. Theodore Burgh's book, Is God Funky or What? Black Biblical Culture and Contemporary Popular Music. And so it's a great book if you haven't read it.
Yep.
And so tonight's guests are going to be Dr. Daniel White Hodge and Miss Angie Hong. And it's really great talking to them. These are actually colleagues of Mike's that he'll be able to share a little bit more about. And so he has a bit of a history, just like I did with Dr. Burgh. With Teddy, he has a bit of a history too. So we'll get to hear a little bit about that. And so my name is Kate T. and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Religion at Montclair State University. And my research focus is comparative genocide studies. My co-host, Mike Viega, who you heard from a moment ago, is also an assistant professor in music at the John C. Calley School of Music at Montclair State as well. And his clinical and research experience is in music therapy. So before we begin our conversation, Mike and I would like to acknowledge our sponsors and talk a little bit about our journey, kind of how we got here with this broadcast, and then without further ado, introduce our guests so that we can start having an exciting chat. So thank you to the MSU John C. Calley School of Music, Department of Religion, Institute for the Humanities, College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and Research on Interdisciplinary Global Studies, also known as RIGS, which is a faculty group for research at Montclair. So thank you to you all for supporting this event. Like our prior 3 installments, this conversation will be recorded and available on YouTube. So just want to remind you of that. And you can just go to YouTube and type Is God Funky or What? And you'll be able to see the 3 prior episodes. And then tonight's episode will also be available in about a week. So we invite you to watch, or in some case, rewatch those particular episodes. Again, the guests were Dr. Teddy Burgh for episode 1, Ms. Toni Blackman for episode 2, and then Dr. Hakeem Leonard was our guest for 3. So again, before introducing our guests, Mike and I would like to talk a little bit about our journey. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mike to share a little bit, and then I'll come in at the end to share my thoughts before we get to our guests.
The past couple of episodes, I located myself within this journey, and you can go back and watch those. But I'm left with more questions and answers after our last three guests, in a good way, that speaks well to our topic and the many intersections here. We started with Dr. Theodore Burr and him sharing about the prophecies of Sam Cooke and the prophecy of Missy Elliott and the prophecy of Tupac, going into Toni Blackman and the wisdom of the cipher and the healing that comes out of the cipher and her history, located being in Oakland and her history with Black biblical culture and how that informs her work in the cipher. And then Dr. Hakeem Leonard, who, brought us into Black identity in relation to current events like the insurgency in January. At the time, it was Black History Month, and really taking us into the many intersections of music, Black identity, in relation to therapy and healing. So here we are today with two guests who I'm so excited to be welcoming, Dr. Daniel White Hodge and Angie Hong. And yes, Angie and I went to Temple University together, graduate school, what seems like forever ago, but and we would have these great philosophical debates against quantitative research and qualitative research. And I was always, on the side of qualitative research all the way. And she was very statistical. But I think times have changed, perhaps, in a great way for both of us. And it's great to welcome them both, and really be in a group of multiracial, multi-identities within within the intersections of what we're talking about here in terms of Black biblical culture, popular music styles, healing, health, and race and identity. And so we could go in so many directions, but here I am in the unknown, ready to go in any direction that we need to go into, Kate. So
fantastic. I'm feeling the same, and Angie and Dan and I, we were all talking earlier and saying, this is it. We're in it. Like, this has just been such a great experience. And for those of you who've seen prior episodes, it really is meant to be a kind of conversational, free-flowing opportunity to bring together some really interesting ideas. But it also, in one way in which I've been thinking about this more recently, is that we're talking about artistry and we're talking about music. And then we've had music that's been contributed by the people who have all participated. But we're also creating, if you will, our own kind of melodic adventure in these conversations and the volley back and forth between the three, or in this case, the four of us. That's really been gratifying for me as a scholar to be engaged in yet another different type of creative process that I don't always have the opportunity to do. So that's really been rewarding for me, and I hope for our audience members. And then the last big point that I'll make is that as a scholar of religion, it's always exciting to be able to talk about religion, spirituality, in this particular case, Black spirituality, in a way that really speaks to people beyond what we often see within what we call the ivory towers of higher education. And so having the opportunity to do that, and especially in this time, so when Mike and I met, I guess it's been about a little over 2 years ago now. We were a part of a program called Teaching Fellows. So we both had gotten this fellowship, to enhance our teaching. And then toward the end of it, Mike's like, talking to me, and I'm talking to Mike. And I remember too, Mike is in the School of Music and I'm in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. So without this opportunity to meet each other, we wouldn't necessarily have crossed over, So to bring together our two colleges as well, right, has been really exciting. And so Mike and I talked about putting this program together that ended up transitioning online because of the pandemic. We had no idea, of course, the pandemic was going to happen. We had no idea that the Black Lives Matter movement was going to erupt. We had no idea there was going to be an insurrection. We had no idea there'd be, so much kind of Asian American hate and vitriol. We didn't know any of that was going to happen. So this has been a fantastic space for talking about not only kind of religion and Black biblical culture and hip hop, but also about these things going on in our world right now in the middle of a pandemic, and so in that way, this has really been a fantastic space. And again, we invite all of you to be with us here now for what actually would be a little longer than usual. So we're actually going to conclude closer to 6:30 for our talk because we have two guests. And I don't want to hold us up any longer and do want to introduce our first guest. Is that okay with you, Mike, to get us rolling?
I'll get us rolling.
Okay.
And just to let you know, if you were here for the intro, and you can watch it again, but there'll be more coming when we do the outro. But the music you were hearing in the bumper was done by none other than Dr. Daniel White Hodge, who is one of our guests. And I'm telling you, I had a hard time choosing which song or which composition, I was going to actually put up front because they're all just totally fire and amazing. And I can't wait to hear more and to hear more about his musical artistry and process in relation to these topics as well.
Exactly.
But to get a little formal here, Dr. Daniel White Hodge is a recognized hip hop cultural expert and cultural literacy communications scholar. Dr. Hodge is professor of intercultural communications, department chair of the communication arts department, and research lead on the Catalyst -606 program in Chicago, Chi-Town. His research interests are at the intersection of faith, hip hop, space right there for more, because there's a lot more. Visit whitehodge.com for links to his many books. Podcast, Profound Faith is an amazing podcast in which Angie was one of the featured guests. A great episode there too if you want more. Essays, a link to his TEDx presentation, and so much more. So please visit that link. And also Angie Hong, who is a Korean American worship leader, writer, and speaker. Most recently, she served as the creative director at the Chicago campus of Willow Creek Community Church and has led worships for various churches and events such as the annual Christian Community Development Association, the Justice Conference, and the Duke Divinity School Summer Institute for Reconciliation. She's a contributor to Faith and Leadership and writes and speaks about identity, worship, and decolonization. And also has a fantastic new article out on Reckon. And I'll post a link to that in the chat too, a very timely link, our article, very beautifully written. So thanks again to everybody who is joining us, and please feel free to ask questions. And without further ado, I'm going to pull up Angie and Dan into our screen here. Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
It's
All
so
right.
Get
great.
it started.
I know, yeah. So as I once heard a wise person say, "Let's get this party started."
That's right. That's right.
So I'll start us off with our first question, and so that is, as you know, this is called the "Is God Funky or What" series. And so one of the driving issues in the book and with our interview with Dr. Teddy Burgh was that we've really been exploring this kind of what we call sacred profane divide. And kind of where it comes from and why people sometimes feel uncomfortable about the idea that there isn't a divide, if we can argue that there isn't one. And so, for instance, when we talk about things like particular artists being prophets, right, who are in popular music, but considering them prophets, this is one of those ways in which we might talk about in a kind of more illustrative way, this idea that the sacred and the profane is not a divide, but yet actually maybe something else. And so Mike and I were talking, and this is actually a quote from a TED Talk actually that Dan did, is, quote, "Where is unity in the profane? How do we love God? How do we love self? And how do we love others in that?" Right. So that quote in itself kind of challenges the idea of the sacred profane divide. So what we're asking is that kind of part of this journey in our conversation that has taken several iterations over the course of the series. Can you talk to us about this sacred profane divide, your thoughts on that? Why don't we go with Angie first?
Oh, I was like, oh, take it away, Dan. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm just really honored to be here. And Mike and I go way back. So this is so great to have a little reunion.
Yes.
And I also do have background in music therapy as well, and now in seminary. So this divide, I have been reading a lot about sort of this divide and how it intersects with also civil rights movement. With you've got Martin Luther King, you've got Rosa Parks, you've got all these like politics of respectability, this like all developing, and then all of it comes back together again during the 70s, and then hip hop sort of rises out of that, and so I just think that, I am from a Christian religious background, and when I study the work and the life what Jesus did.
Mhm.
I do think he was he did confuse it. He did confuse this idea of sacred, holiness, righteousness, and just complete outlaw, outlandish
Right.
behavior, hip hop
Mhm.
behavior, and confusing
Right.
and blurring those lines.
Right.
And if the body of Jesus, who is actually God and who actually is profane, sacred, profane,
Right.
is on earth as not a royalty, just
Mhm.
in a colonized society.
Yeah.
How are we then to divide? It's like dividing like the body of Jesus into two separate things.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the body of Jesus, right, who he was on earth, was confusing everybody, because here is this person who is God, not just a teacher, not just a prophet, but who is actually God himself, as being just like this regular man from the outskirts of town in a colonized society. As the colonized, what is his business? What business does he have saying all these things? Also, he spoke in parables, which are basically ciphers. He did not have clear, clean-cut answers, right? And so when you talk about the art of hip hop and Black music, you think, wow, there is so much symbolism. There's so many parallels there that confuse everything about what is appropriate, what is respectable, what is sacred, what is profane, what is secular,
Mhm.
what is sacred. And I believe that Black people in America they lead that 1,000%. I
Mhm.
mean, they lead that 1,000%. So if the work that is sort of being done by this art is to continue to blur those lines, I don't see how you can separate it from our religious tradition.
Right.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah. So Dan, you want to hop in on this?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything Sister Angie is talking about. I think I always say, Jesus was hip hop, right? If you think about it, this cat was from a place that was hated, right? He had baby mama drama, right? You know what I'm saying? He was hated by the police, right? He was beat down by the authorities and stuff. Hung out with 12 knuckleheads. I mean, so there's all these elements that I think that we have to begin to look at. My good friend and colleague, Ebony Utley, takes a really good look at the connections right there with, in her book, The Gangster's God, and looking at really just kind of some of those profane, secular, and sacred elements. This is kind of what some of the methodology that I use. Y'all were talking about qualitative beforehand. I'm a big qualitative myself. So I use John Michael Spencer's theomusicology, and to better understand that, it's really looking at the elements of Jesus beyond the colonized view of who Jesus is in Western evangelical traditions, right?
Mhm.
A peacemaker, somebody who was very nice and said the right things. Jesus went off on people. Like, he would say things equivalent to the F word we would look at today. Jesus would go into place. What's that?
He flipped the
Exactly.
tables.
Exactly. Of the things that we know about. And if you look at, other archaeological history of where Jesus was and what Jesus did around there, I mean, there was a lot of stuff that Jesus did, right? And so I think he would be foreign to us right now in terms of how we've created this image, this imagination of who Christ is. There was a clear marker of the sacred, secular, and profane. Jesus was in the streets. He was in the hood. He was in there. And knowing all those things, he would still just go off on people, right? And I think about, like, for example, if you think about it, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, in John 6, kind of narrates all of these things. Yeah, he's feeding people, he's turning, all these fishes and the loaves into different things. And then people are still asking him, like, yeah, but are you sure? Are you sure you're, what I'm saying? Like, quote us, that Moses gave us the manna in the desert. So, what are you gonna do? And he's just like, and he just goes off on him, like, fool, really? Like, you really believe like that wasn't Moses? That wasn't that nigga? Shoot, that was God. That was my father. So, I don't know. I'll keep it PG-13 on here. But, at the end of the day,
Don't keep it PG. You don't censor yourself.
At the end of the day, I just think that we overlooked the historical really roughness of who Jesus was. So I couldn't agree more with that image. And that goes throughout the canonical literature of the people who, the characters that we've seen through there. And so that embodies that. But I get that I teach at a school where there are still students that cannot see the divide. I was like, it's only sacred.
Mm-hmm.
That's secular. And so we got to avoid it. That whole Niebuhrian paradigm, right? Of like, Christ against culture. So, we can't go in there. We'll be influenced and see, that was the reason why you got problems, because you went to the club the other night. And I mean, I'm just so tired of that old fashioned religion, if I can put that out there.
Right. Gotcha. And we've talked about too, kind of the legacy of colonialism and how, as part of, like, for instance, as a scholar of religion, when we talk about the founding of religion that would later become a field of study in the 19th century, along with other disciplines like sociology and what have you, this is also in the middle of the rise of things like Darwinism, right? And the rise of things like Darwinism, and then racial difference being mapped onto that. And so when we have early people who are then colonizing Africa and intersecting with people who often indigenous peoples, they bring with them this idea of this divide. Whereas that's not really a natural distinction, right, amongst many early peoples. And then because Christianity ended up becoming such a dominant and such a defining part of Western society, we often end up inheriting these notions without really thinking about where they come from. And so this kind of, I think, divide that we often just kind of ideologically accept, and it's its invisibility that makes it so acceptable, right? Because we don't really think about where it comes from. It's just kind of a given. But we also have to think about where that comes from. And I think that's important to point out. And like you said, why is it that we've now somehow gone this 180 about how we think about Jesus Christ? And then the last thing I'll say is, I had this moment where you talked about flipping over the table, and I had like a turntable moment, right? I was like, oh, flipping the table on the turntable, flipping the beat on the turntable. I just had this moment.
It.
Just thought I'd share that. But yeah, but you're gonna say something, Mike?
It touches upon, again, so many different paths and ways to go. I think about the divide as a purposeful kind of colonial tool for oppression, and that speaks directly towards health and continuous re-traumatic experiences of saying, no, this is just pop music over here. The feelings you're experiencing at the concert, the feelings you're experiencing while listening, that may feel connection and everything, that's just entertainment. Now, of course, hip hop is, great entertainment business. Kendrick Lamar is a great entertainer. I saw him live, and it was an amazing show, an entertainer. But for many people who were at that show, they were also, receiving the word, and were there for prophecy. They were there for transformation. They were there to be transformed, and he held space and power on that stage. So, I feel like that oftentimes we work with people, who are in limited resource communities, who might have psychiatric, needs, who might have, who might be in a child welfare system, and to keep reinforcing that what they're bringing to us is just entertainment, or worse, we'll just censor it all the way. Because I've worked in too many places where they just said, no, you can't play any hip hop here. Right. And that gets me just, people talk about cancel culture. And I'm like, listen, true cancel culture is having worked at so many facilities where hip hop was just outright banned, where I couldn't even engage as a therapist with people on their on not only something that's entertaining for them, but possibly is transforming, healing, and spiritual. So there's no question there. I started getting angry.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, we talked about making it real, right?
Yeah.
So so I don't know if you want to ask this question, Mike, or I can, but yeah, this just kind of just really dovetails beautifully into something we talked about earlier, which is this idea of decolonization is not a metaphor, and about the work that hip hop does. Would you like to ask this question, Mike, or shall I forge ahead?
Well, no, go for it. Keep forging ahead.
Okay, yeah, sure. So this actually came up in a conversation that we had earlier too. And so there's an article by Eve Tuck and K-Wei Yang from 2012. And the article, which is wildly popular, it's been cited like over 3,000 that wasn't a mistake, 3,000 times this article. And it's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I think it has deep implications for the kind of work that hip hop is doing based on some of the conversations that we've had. Could you talk a little bit more about that, about the fact that hip hop brings to life, right, the very title of this article, which is that, decolonization is not a metaphor, and that hip hop is actually doing some really, really important kind of healing work?
Sure. You want me to kick that off? Or you want to go with Angie?
Sure. Well, I guess since Angie went last time, we'll go with the hand.
All right. Well, I think that the elements of hip hop culture, right, really present themselves as decolonizing elements. When you think about, and when I talk about the elements, I'm talking about, aspects of community, aspects of searching for a deity, aspects of being able to connect with something beyond yourself. And, in my classes, we trace the origins of hip hop all the way back to 5th and 6th century, Central and Western, Southern Africa. I think what has come up in terms of its popular element, most scholars would say, emerged around 1971, 1972, in terms of its musical form. But that element was there. It was just a wing of part of, the Black experience. And really those who are marginalized is really a sense of pushing back, protest and praise, if you will, to push back against those elements and those systems, right, that have held people back. Now, as one young person told me, in one of my classes when I was reading the definition of hip hop, like, how it questions and counters, systems of power. They were like, well, hip hop has become that system of power now. It's like when you think about it, it's like so much of hip hop today, commercial hip hop, sounds the same. I was listening to a cat off of Hip Hop DX, and he was talking about how, I'm spacing his name, from Atlanta, Outkast was like, one of the greatest, artists of all time. Right. But you think about it, it's like his music doesn't sound like anybody else's. When I think about those artists that are making an impact, because I think about so much of commercial rap is like junk food. It's like, it'll fill you up on certain levels, but man, it ain't really good for you. And so, and again, I don't mean to be that critical, but true hip hop is pushing towards a deconstructing of who you are as a person, where you situate yourself in a community, how you locate yourself theologically, and then in relation to other people, right? And how you connect to them. All those aspects push back against the norms that say, well, folks should be this way, right? Or folks should act this way, or we should pray this way, whatever that may be, whatever that, hip hop is going to push back against that. So I think that's what I look for. That's one of the first elements that I look for in researching hip hop. What is that? How does that connect? And because it wasn't like, it's like the same way we have booty artists now, we had booty artists back in the 80s and 90s too. What I'm saying? So I think, again, we have to be critical enough, but at its core, hip hop is questioning that. I mean, think about a song like NWA, and NWA has their problems. They're problematic on many levels when it comes to their engagement with women and understanding right of that. And we have to talk about that. Right. think about their engagement with F the Police. I mean, when you think about a song like that is put out and at that particular time, what that meant, and that it's still played today, and what that means, right, in relation to George Floyd, right, in relations to Breonna Taylor, those then become elements of a decolonizing sense. And when you listen to interviews of cats that are talking about stuff like that, they're pushing it much further than just a song. This was embedded in who they were as a person. But I'll stop there.
Well, I just want to say, because that's a good example of what Angie and I were talking before broadcast, in terms of we get all the time in music therapy, for instance, a clinician might be like, well, what's an appropriate, give me an appropriate song to play with these group of teenagers. I need an appropriate rap song. My response back is always like, well, who are you to judge what's appropriate and not appropriate? Because for me, fuck the police, or what's a positive song? What's a negative song? Like, I need a positive rap song to work with these kids. I'm like, well, why isn't fuck the police a positive rap song? Right. I mean, and so, in terms terms of like challenging those social constructs, it's really important. Angie.
Yeah, Angie.
What
And
are your
Angie, I remember
thoughts?
in a prior conversation that talked about hip hop as resistance and even resistance against nihilism. And so, yeah, so if you want to start there or someplace else, yeah, that'd be
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that.
You're welcome.
conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so I think what we're referencing there is sort of the emergence of trap and how it is just seen as this. I mean, now it's like a whole sound, right? But it was a place before that, and it was a place where different things happened, but the music itself kind of came out of the place to resist sort of a nihilism of devolving or settling, right? It became an expression. And so if you're expressing where you are, what you're going through, your geopolitical positions, I think that in itself is the work of expressing. But then to have that turned around on you, used against you, right? In the state of Maryland, is it that it's against your rap lyrics can be used
Right.
against you in a court of law,
I
right?
think that's we see case after case of that.
Yeah.
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 Right. So this method of expression that is meant to sort of resist against nihilism and devolving into that sense of just giving up, and this art form that emerges out of it is then used against you to kind of keep you down. And this whole like ironic structure to me is just sort of evidence of, in the white Western imagination, Black bodies are dependent on to die. I mean, there is no room for a Black imagination. There's little room for other imaginations besides a white Western narrative of progress, which in turn requires violence and harm done to people of color, especially Black bodies.
Right.
Yeah.
So it works in different ways. The racism works in different ways, but like for me as an Asian American, I am an alien. I am forever foreign. People ask me where I'm from all the time, where I'm really from all the time. They tell me my English is good.
Right.
They call me China doll or a dragon lady. They can call me whatever they want because I'm always the foreigner. I'm an Oriental. Black bodies are a little bit, the nuance of Black bodies is that Black bodies are not considered human. So it's like, what is human about a Black body versus how do foreign bodies, like Asian bodies, belong? It's very nuanced in how the structures work. But it is all within a white Western imagination that is dependent on these narratives to continue about Black bodies, Asian bodies, other bodies,
right?
Indigenous bodies.
And there's an element of fetishizing too that often goes into those bodies. And there's a term that's since kind of been adopted in different ways, but some of you may be familiar with the concept of necropolitics, right? This idea of the death dealing that comes with certain policies that affect certain segments of society, and that in order for certain orders to remain in place, that means that there have to be people who are subject to the decisions that are made that are matters of life and death. And so that kind of necropolitics, that kind of death dealing that people of color deal with on a regular basis, that's part of why systemic racism is able to stay in place, is very important. But like Angie's saying, though, the way in which different people of color experience those things isn't always the same, but it's destructive nonetheless. Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about flipping the beat, changing the narrative, remixing? I think about like the turntable, right? As a means to an end. I put records on that turntable and music comes out, and that's what it is, society. And then you had Cool Herc coming in and saying, no, this is more than that. This is an instrument. This is my form of expression. You got, Grandmaster Theodore inventing the scratch, which a few years later will be part of Herbie Hancock's Rocket, and soloed on a jazz record. It took off, but the sensibility of white culture, that was like an affront to sensibilities, right? Like, no, turntable, that's just noise, right? But for many people, that was, we're contacting interstellar planets because we, because life on earth here sucks, like this is what with our condition right now. We want to envision new futures, new narratives. I think of Outcast, Afrofuturism, of Janelle Monáe. And so, I want to ask first Angie to talk a little bit about how you flipped and remixed your own narrative in your own, musical landscape. I'm going to put in the chat here the article from Reckon, where you speak very poignantly about your own life, being born in San Jose, California, and then coming to the South and living in Atlanta, where, there was all stairs. So, maybe if you could speak to that in your own life, how you flipped the remix in your own life.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the South. So the article that Chris, sorry, that Mike is referencing is having to do with sort of my position as sort of in a liminal space, right? I'm like in the middle of this sort of white and black binary. And because of that, there has been a lot of ways in which people have used that to their advantage or disadvantage within the white gaze. So model minority being used as a wedge politics, all of that is used for the purposes of advancing, in the white gaze and that Western imagination, that white Western imagination. And even in music, right? So I'm a worship leader. So people would come to me and be like, I know what white Christian music sounds like. It's like hymns, and it's like this thing called CCM, Hillsong, Bethel. And then, I know what black music is because that's just gospel. So you have like CCM and then you have gospel. And then the people in the middle are just, everybody else is just multicultural. And so there were a lot of, people saying like, well, diversity is important, but when you come and you lead us, like, we want you to define and be like the face of like Asian American worship and what it sounds like and what it looks like. And I just had to say, in the end, it's a lot of pressure. It was a lot of coercive sort of mimeticism of a race of all of Asia. I'm sorry, not going to happen. And I just kind of had to say, no, I'm not going to do that. It could be a holy no, it could be a hell no, but I'm not doing that because that, again, it's a way of keeping the categories very, very neat, defined, sanitized. The lines are drawn very, very well. And I myself just complicate that narrative as an Asian American person. And then also, I didn't grow up in LA. I didn't grow up in New York. I didn't grow up in Northern Virginia. Let's see, where else are all the Asians? But like, I didn't grow up in those places. I grew up in the South, like at a time where there weren't that many Asians in the South.
Right.
And so me also being an Asian American from the South complicates those sorts of narratives even further. And I think that within that, there's a lot of freedom and liberation in understanding that as a part of my identity and owning it, that it can come out, it can sound however it wants to sound, and that will be Asian American enough. That will be Southern enough. Right. That will be woman enough. That will be Christian enough. It all counts. And so I just think of, when I think about Outkast, that complicated the narrative of East and West Coast rap. I mean, I'm not saying that I can identify that 100%, but there are a lot of common words that are used, like liminality and going in between the binary and just having a totally different thing that sounded just as black and rap as any other kind of rap. So I just think that is a narrative that kind of helps and shapes like who I am. It informs me to resist the narrative of being contained. I'm not going to do that.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm not playing the game.
Wow. I don't think Dan's playing it either.
Well, I mean, I think, and I love that. I mean, I love hearing what Angie is talking about because, again, these perspectives are important. I mean, I think I love that you said, you trouble the narrative because I think there's so much of that is to get along in the world, sometimes. And I know I did this early on just in my career, and I was working for an evangelical outreach organization, and it was easy for me, right, to just be the funny black guy. And it would always rub me wrong, but I just didn't have the words for it then when people would say, well, these black people, man, but not you, Dad, or not you, we're talking about them over there, and dealing with donors, this was at the height of the Silicon Valley, because I was in California and stuff. And so this is right at the height of the Silicon Valley revolution. So people, literally had $500,000, $800,000 just to give. Like, I got to give it to somebody, let me give it to those poor kids, in the hood, so long as they don't date my daughter. I mean, and so like those narratives, but it's like when you begin to speak out, then it becomes your problem, right? It's like when a woman says, no, you don't touch me like that. Don't talk to me like that. Now, all of a sudden she's a bitch.
Mm-hmm.
A few minutes ago, you wanted to have all kind of relations with her, but now she's actually standing there. Now she's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes that same way when you get into a situation, right? And, we in the academy, y'all know how it is. I see no difference between the ideological structures of the street, growing up on the street with the hierarchy, with cats who, do stuff on the street and do dirt on the street, and folks who, in the academy, right? You got all that hierarchy that exists. And that's part of why I've been able to survive for 2 decades in the academy, is because I've been able to apply those same skills that I used in South Central, in Oakland, in the academy, right? And now that I'm tenured and a full professor, I mean, that adds something. But I also know I joined a I just read this the other day, 0.025% of a group of black full tenured professors in the entire country.
Wow.
Right? So just me coming and talking about hip hop, when I first started researching religion and hip hop, Anthony Penn talked about it in, Noise and Spirit, and that was about it. You had some older books by Cornel West and whatnot, the blues, spirituality, blues, and hip hop. But most people were like, really?
Right.
You're going to try to do, ooh, man, I don't know. That's just so out there. I mean, and so, again,
and then Cornell West put out an album, right? And they're like, should that count as scholarship or not?
Right, exactly. Exactly. And for me, it's the same thing. Like Mike said, it's like, you think about, I want a positive song. Rap's just so negative. Like, oh, you already coming at it, faulty. And it's the same way. It's like Tupac is Christian music. You know what I'm saying? And Kendrick Lamar is that essence of spirituality. When I think about holy hip hop, that is Kendrick Lamar, and them are that. And so, but that's a challenge that disrupts that narrative. And that's also the colonization that exists within people of color. You know what I'm saying? In some of these spaces that are near and dear to me, that I grew up in, some of these little conference settings and stuff, they're very colonized. They, tend to look at things very theologically bent towards a Western way. So trying to go in there and tell them that, Jesus used words like the equivalent to the F word is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said anything like that. And it becomes this troubling thing. And rather than dealing with it, and rather than help, pushing further, like, let me push a little bit further into this discomfort, this dissonance that I'm experiencing. It's hell no. I don't want to do anything with you, which is really, as a country, that's where we're at right now. Like, if you disagree with me, I'm gonna kill you. Right. It's not even agree to disagree. Like, no, you have to think my way, and it, that's part of that. And that troubling sense that I feel like when I leave the current university that I'm at, they're going to be like, whew, thank God, man. Golly, thank God. But anyways, I'll stop with that. I like that what Angie was saying about troubling and the narrative.
Can I say something to that real quick? So this whole thing with, rap being so negative and wanting to like contain it and everything. So it used to be, right, that like a protest would reference a African-American spiritual in protesting on the street, Black Lives Matter. And now people are referencing Kendrick Lamar.
Sure.
right? We're going to be all right. And so I feel like that is a shift that represents a shift in how this narrative of church and religion being like on the forefront of, advocating for those, loving our neighbors, and injustice and
Right.
oppression. That narrative is also being complicated right now with Black Lives Matter.
Yep.
And so when people are talking about the liturgy of protest that's happening with Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter is not, priest in collars on the forefront with their robes taking the pictures and making the speeches and the sermons, it becomes like this, well, no, like we can't say that. We can't ascribe to that. We cannot ascribe to that hashtag because it's uncontainable right now. And I think that this is a very important, but I think overall good shift in the further blurring of the lines of who is fighting for justice here,
Yes.
Also, the second thing I want to talk about is just art in general. And so it makes me think that, we do privilege, the Western imagination does privilege certain arts over others. It's not like Western art doesn't have naked bodies, is any less misogynistic,
Right.
isn't, saying all sorts of manners of things. It's not like that doesn't exist. It totally exists, but we have been conditioned to think that that is fine art, high art, versus hip hop, which can't reach that level. So there's a lot of implications about how we even teach art, like our pedagogical methods and
That's true.
and like our privileging of what is considered good art.
Yes, that's very true.
Yeah.
That's very true. I'll also just add too that with that and what Angie is talking about, particularly with art, because there's more to hip hop than just the music. I mean, the music is great, right? Then that's the large part that drives it. But once you begin to deep dive down into it, there's all kind of other components of art that again push against that narrative, and it makes a lot of folks feel uncomfortable. Like even when I was doing my PhD, folks just didn't know how to handle that. It's like, oh, well, don't you want to go and look at, James Wagner and the missiology of yeah, that's cool. But, I want to talk about Tupac and hit him up. Like, I want to talk about his beef with Biggie and even some of the beefs that we've had, within churches and stuff. And I always say, if Christianity, because Angie said it, we're at a divide right now, and we're at a real big crossroads, and there's more in that goes into, so I don't want to simplify it too much, but I will say that if Christianity is going to survive, I think it's going to have to really look at and embrace what hip hop theology really is bringing.
And I think you're right to talk about, go ahead. Angie was getting ready to drop some more knowledge.
No, that got me thinking too, it's not only with art, but it's also privileging a certain type of theology, meaning there is this one way to think about scripture. There's this one way to practice your religion. And when there are multiple avenues and multiple theologies that exist, you've got Black theology, you've got womanist theology, you've got mujerista theology, you've got all of these that make up a multiple cosmology of beliefs and ideas that all ascribe to, this religious notion of Jesus, just in this case, in the Christian religion, right? Because that's what I know and can speak from. But there's all these things. But what is considered, authentic theology with a capital T?
Yeah.
It's the white Western one. And so by otherizing other theologies, you are developing this this striation and hierarchy that is not real. It is not real.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you're talking about that too, because when we're talking about the sacred profane binary, you're right. I wasn't thinking about, we haven't talked as much about the binary of what we understand to be art or fine art or high art. And in the class that I teach on African religions, this kind of struck me as you were talking. it's and so in African religions, in this particular article that I had the students read, it indicated that how we think about art is also an inherited Western colonized idea, where you go to a place, right? You go to a museum, you look at something on a wall, you look at it in quiet and silence, right? Whereas the author was contending that within, say, certain countries in the continent of Africa, art was something that was everyday objects, right? Art was something that didn't have to aesthetically, even what we might consider pleasing, in order to be considered art. And that art was experienced in noise, right? It's experienced in community. It's not experienced as something you off solo contemplate and think about. But if most of us think about art, we think the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or we think about, the Louvre, or, these places where you go and have to sit and contemplate in silence things that hang on walls and that we find aesthetically pleasing. And we take it for granted. And then we compare that against something like hip hop, right? So we talk about the artistry. It's like, yeah, there are people shouting and there are people swearing. There are people talking about everyday lives, and they're talking about pimps, and they're talking about, right, and we think, oh, that's not art, right? And it's because we do have this, I think, sense of trying to neaten things that makes people feel uncomfortable in thinking about hip hop as an actual art.
I actually wonder now, like in terms of, thinking of binary, why, the music, the soundscape, the music, a studio, but more than even just a studio, the beats, the musical environment itself being in many ways, a church space, a space for testimony, because when you give listening up front to some of Dan's music, each beat that he provided had its own world to live in which a whole new narrative would come up for each one, and usually spontaneous narrative, or a narrative that speaks to a different part of my lived experience. I know that, we talked about the album Section 80 by Kendrick Lamar, and I think about the first song in which he says, fire burning inside my eyes, this music that saved my life. Y'all be calling it hip hop, I be calling it hypnotized. Hypnotized, trap my body, but free my mind. And I feel like that beat, that trap, it keeps you in the groove, but then you can reach a higher power, you can reach a higher connection. And for me, that binary of like, a studio of music entertainment versus church and testimony and who you are. But for many people, for a lot of youth, finding that studio space in a neighborhood is the closest thing to church that they're going to authentically get. Dan, what do you think in terms of being a beat maker yourself and what that space has been like for you?
I think absolutely. And I think about just even the evolution of studios, right? I came up at a time when, everything was analog, right? It was tape. Maybe you can get into DAT machines, which was, just digital audio tape, or ADATs, which was really popular in the 90s, especially in the Bay Area. Especially if you listen to any kind of Bay Area music, Too Short, God Rest His Soul, Shock G, and Digital Underground, all that stuff. Those were recorded at two different studios, all using ADATs, DAT tape. Like, these are tapes. So there was a certain sound, and anyone who's ever worked with reel to reel knows them damn things is maintenance heavy. It's like a partner that's just draining everything, man. You got to replace the heads, you got to deal with that. But now we can do an entire song, right? Entire orchestration on devices like this now.
Right.
So, and I get that there's a whole conversation around that. I get that there's a lot of cats that from my generation that say, no, man, you got to have this and you got to be able to twist knobs. I get that there's something here. In fact, I'm recording through an analog mixer right now, a 24-track mixer and stuff. And so I still have those elements of it, but how do we bridge with what's new, right? Like, a lot of those songs that you heard, I actually created and put together on an iPad, just using GarageBand. Now, when I mix it down and, I run it through some APIs or some Neve processors, which for those of you, again, who are into music, like API and Neve are kind of like, the golden standard for, like recording processors and DSPs, right? But I think those things just didn't exist. So this is what I find so interesting, is that people are desiring that sound, right, from the 90s and 80s. Because it was so funny, because all of us were trying to aspire to get your stuff to sound clean, working hard. You know, you push the highs on a tape because you knew you were going to lose, right? Some sound, going to tape. So my point, though, is that there's still this love of the old without really giving the old its deference and its true commitment. I see all the time as a beat maker, right, these sample packs and everything, and like, oh, I'll teach you how to do hip hop, and so much of it is white splaining. Really, it really is. It's like somebody heard some albums, somebody wants to get a lo-fi sound. You don't even know what lo-fi even means. You just know it sounds a certain way. I saw a YouTube tutorial, and now I can compose it on these. So there is an issue, right, of people just being able to grab this stuff and go in it. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. There is something spiritual that happens. I remember this is back in the day, working with Bone Thugs and Harmony. And we recorded that at Black Hole Recording Studios in Hawthorne, California. Kenny Smith was the engineer. And he'd already done all kinds of albums that, before that and stuff. But there was something about putting that album together and working with and better understanding what death meant in a Black context. What did it mean to actually go beyond Judeo-Christianity and explore what other theological avenues and stuff? And there was something that was going on as we were recording that. And a lot of cats, as you know, studios were so damn expensive back in the day, right? You were lucky if you got something under $500 an hour to go and do the high end stuff. But now, because it's been so democratized, it's very easy to lose that essence. There's something about working with somebody else. And those of you who play instruments know what I'm talking about. Like that combination of coming together and recording. There's something about hitting record and just playing and seeing what comes out. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I can still go back into my DAW and rework it and whatever, but there is a spiritual element. There is a search for that and the beyond in that. And I do think that there's something powerful that happens when we allow it and when we acknowledge what the ancestors are trying to say. Is I even went into music, when I put stuff together, I allow the music and the beat to tell me what else needs to go in there. Like what else needs to come? Do we need a flute? Do we not? Let me pull back. Do we not? Does it just need to be just something really simple? How do I mix these things, right? It's like cats who would sit in the studio and work on snares and hi-hats. And I get but it's one of the reasons why people love certain albums. Think about that. Think about your favorite album. There's a sound to that. Somebody did some hard labor and just pouring out of their soul onto that, whether it was a Neve 8066 board or an SSL, what have you, or it might have just been in front of I had a simple Elise 1622 mixer that I recorded a lot of stuff on and then took it to a bigger studio. There is something about that recording process that is very theological.
Yeah, I like how you're also going back to Angie's point earlier about the fact that Jesus Christ was both spirit and corporal, right? Like both something physical and something spiritual. Because we've been talking a lot about people receiving music as something spiritual, but you're actually talking about the spirituality in making the music. Yes. And that part of that comes from the physicality of turning a knob or being in the room with other people and organically having something come of being in that room together and and then just being, right? So I really love this conversation about the physicality of spirituality, which maybe we don't often think about, and about the process of the music and not just the receiving of the music. And I know here we got about 20 minutes left, so I don't know what do we want to do, Mike, so far as I know, right? This conversation is just like, I'm loving it. Do we want to stop and see if we have any questions?
We don't have any questions yet, but
okay.
I think we should put it out there to the universe.
Okay.
If you do have any questions, you could type them in the chat either on YouTube or Facebook Live, whatever you're watching us from. And and if not, that's okay, because we can keep talking for a couple hours. But
exactly.
We would love to hear what you all have to say if you're watching. And if you watch a rebroadcast of this, we'll rebroadcast it too, and you can check out our convo then as well.
Yeah.
Angie, did you have anything you wanted to add? Because
the
ministry of music in terms of
Oh, she's got it.
We get ready to have church. We get ready to have church right now, Dan. Are we having church right now?
No. Stop, Dan. Well, I wanted to go back to your notion, Mike, about the kind of religious practice that takes place in a place like a studio that would make it sort of sacred, right? And the whole act of making music, but not even just the act of making music, the turning of the knobs, like just how it is like a sensing and a knowing of what kinds of sounds go together, how to make it work together. And Dan's point about like, who do you reference? Who do you cite? What sort of religion? Like religion always references the past, right? So like what kinds of things from the past are you trying to incorporate into the present? And then what is the use of technology in this space? Well, technology for the most part in the West is, it is used for colonization, right? Like what can make us the most money as fast as possible, efficiency, I have no time. But in that space of a music studio, there is a sacredness to turning the knobs, to referencing the past, incorporating into the future, and the use of technology to create and to express, and a repurposing and resignification of what technology can actually do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes that studio experience really religious and sacred. At the same time, like mixing it with like, you're going on beyond the boundaries of like sacred and profane, right? Like you're mixing all of that together, but that's what's happening in a space like that. And I would think that, the way that a lot of religious institutions and institutions in general had to adapt to technology in order to meet for worship, meet for their spiritual formation, their religious practices and rituals, there also has been a forced repurposing and a reference to the past in light of a current context and a future, right? Churches that talk about, okay, we're going to go back to the way things were, versus churches that are like, we're never going to go back. Even when we go back to in person, things are not going to be the same.
Right.
Because something happened, right? There was a purpose there. And, people even, making their spaces a Zoom, like home habitat, friendly space. I mean, not my room, of course, but like other people's rooms. And, people even making shrines like in their rooms and like showing that, offering that as a part of like worship at conference spaces, for instance. I mean, everybody's like, take a picture of your shrine or take a picture of your icons and offer that up. I mean, it's a thing. So it's a really interesting time.
I just want to say, because what the conversation now has brought me, because the idea of music being both receiving and giving at the same time, I'm thinking about, I remember I had a youth I worked with who, it was no euphemism, it was no irony, it was straight up serious when he said that the album, by Tupac, Me Against the World, saved his life.
Absolutely.
And that there was no, and that was just real, and the same for people who make music. Music kept me busy, music kept me doing what I needed to be. It kept me off the streets. It got me out of trouble. I had a friend of mine who passed away. He got shot over here. And while I was in a studio, I've heard those stories as too. So music and hip hop it's life changing, life saving. And that's that's what it is. It's no joke.
Exactly. I would add too, just to that, I think that's powerful. I mean, I can also say that was the same for me. I mean, after this was like, early 90s, I had a good friend killed right in front of me, man, and that was for me. I mean, I really buried myself in the studio, and I had a little, like I said, I had a little bedroom studio. I saved up every nickel and dime. Some of it was from the underground economy, so I ain't gonna front, because joints was expensive back in the day, man. So brother had to, come up with some kind of scratch some way. But that kept me from being out on the corner. That kept me from, I would hear like the complex I lived in, everybody used to hang out about, on the corner over here, and they had like a little fence, and everybody would sit on there, and every night the cops would show up harass. You know how cops be. They just show up and they just start harassing. I would hear them, but I'd be in there. And we haven't even talked about, right, the power of the sampler, right? Like, repurposing something, right? And taking that, which was once one thing, and now repurposing it. And that's another form of decolonization, right? Like, let me take this country song that might have won, but the artists and themselves might have been very racist, might have been very sexist in the South, but let me repurpose it for something different. When you begin to, and this was part of my own research, beginning to really break down and analyze Tupac's music, there was a wealth of information in how he layered samples, how he put material together. I was very fortunate to have access, to some of the, to some of the lyrics, not only that, but just some of the rough takes, of his. And there was just something powerful, again, about the sampler, about how and in the 90s, if there wasn't the issues that we have now with sampling, like, right, if you put something out now, it's like we have to put all this back in the day. It's like, shoot, that sounds good. Yep, let's put it on the album and credit it in the CD notes and stuff, man. I worked with DJ Hurricane as well, from the Beastie Boys, and it was interesting just to kind of hear his perspective and how he went about putting music together. Even for the Beastie Boys, who a lot of people thought they were like this party group, but there's so much of it was their especially, even where they're at now. I mean, so much of their work right now, right, is against pushing back against the system and stuff. And just, wanting to pick the right samples. I love the process that Kanye, God bless him, Kanye and Jay-Z
I
went through.
didn't think Kanye would be brought up in here.
Angie and I are familiar. Angie and I are familiar with the South. You know what God bless him means. Yeah.
That is. Well, I mean, I think about his process. There was a whole little documentary that came out right around, right when they were getting to release their album. Watch the Throne, and just their process of listening to different music. Like they said they spent like 3 days just listening to nothing but different tracks to better understand how a snare was put. How did Quincy Jones compose this, right? In an album in 1978. So there's something about that I just find marvelous and spectacular, and I'm able to connect in that way.
Angie, you were laughing.
I just love how Dan is name dropping all these.
I'm just trying to keep up.
I can't believe we got the two of you. I mean, like, I'm just feel so fortunate that we have two people who are so phenomenal to talk to us, on a Thursday evening.
I'm just an old guy who likes to keep his lawn green, so I'm.
Oh my!
Have you taken up knitting too, Dan?
You know what? I don't know. I've thought about it though. I should start making my own sweater and stuff in Chicago.
I mean, because this is also, take knitting, planting. Yeah, these are
things
that we aspire to. Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah. So I'm glad you're mentioning it's like Beastie Boys, DJ Hurricane, KRS-One. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think that also goes back to like the use of citation and not appropriation, right?
Yeah.
So like this reference and reverence to the past. I was, I've been taking hip hop this semester, and it's co-taught by Ninth Wonder, and he does that all the time because he's like a sample machine, and he knows every song on the planet, I'm pretty sure, and and can sample it like nothing. But it's all about like a reference and a reverence to the past, and not just a cheapened, oh, that sounds good, but I have no frame of reference. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know the people. I don't know that. And so when you're talking about music, you're talking about a lot more than just what you hear. You're actually going back in time and talking about the layers, talking about the multiple meanings that is there, talking about the ciphers, talking about the lyricism, the poetry, and the whole aesthetic and ideological aspects of it. And I think that is what makes really good art, right? I mean, that's what really good art is. And I'm just so glad that sort of in the hip hop scholarship that Dan and other people are doing, especially when it comes to religion and hip hop, it's like they're I'm sure there's always a part of that scholarship that's always going to be like trying to justify hip hop as an art form or hip hop and religion as an actual field of study,
Mhm.
like an apologetic stance. But I am thinking, right, that like this iteration or the future generations won't have to do that and can just start going and
Mhm.
talk about, you know, yes, like Tupac, but there is also room for Black music and hip hop artists to have just a fantastical imagination,
Mhm.
to have Afrofuturism and have that be a part of the art too. Like, why can't they exaggerate? Why can't there be like fantastical language,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
or a made up narrative? Like, why can't there be just good storytelling, even if it's fiction?
Right. Yeah. And then why does it? And then and I think we also forget, because this is a thought or a point that's often made about, like, say, feminism. So you were bringing that earlier when we talked about womanist theology, is that it's not about saying that I have to fit a particular idea of a woman. It's about being any kind of woman I want to be, right? That's kind of what it is. And so when we think about hip hop, there's all types of hip hop. There's all sorts of ways in which you can talk about these things. Some that are more really technically sophisticated, some which are less technically sophisticated, right? But I don't have to fit into that mold. That's the point, is that I could just express myself in whatever way I want. And I think people often don't realize, because we've been talking a lot about Tupac Shakur, and this came up in our first podcast with Teddy, is that he was amazingly well-read, right? He was amazingly, technically proficient. He was amazingly, and I don't think people realize that about him, right? They just saw this image of a guy with a cigar without a shirt, and they just made all these presumptions about who he was and what he was capable of. And so one of the things that really touched me, I remember in graduate school, I think I may have told this story before, is that I went to see Nikki Giovanni, who is a Black female poetess, who has the tattoo Thug Life. This woman's like in her mid-70s, I think, at this point, who has a tattoo Thug Life on her arm, right? Which is the one that Tupac had, because she saw the genius in him, even maybe before other people did. As a Black poetess, she saw the genius in Tupac Shakur, and so I'm always blown away, I guess, by how pigeonholed we try to make hip hop and rap artists. And I'm also kind of surprised by the conversations we've been able to have about the commodification part, which you were talking about before too, is that's sometimes a harder conversation to have, about the commodification of artistry and about all the problems. But at the same time, people don't hear your stuff, right, if you don't market it, or if it's not monetized in some kind of way. And that's another one of those, I think, liminal spaces, right? Like the place where the music happens, and then the layer, and I'm sure Dan can speak to this too, and the layer that comes with producing it and getting it out and advertising it and getting royalties, and those kinds of things. That's also a part of what it means to make music.
There's so many layers to that, right?
Mhm.
I know, right?
Like the whole notion of authenticity, right? Like the in order for this to be hip hop, it has to be authentic. But what you actually get when the song comes out is a result of this whole process of marketing and developing an aesthetic, developing looks, especially in the case of women, right? Like, are you going to be like looking this way? Are you going to look to this way? What's your market? And so by the time you get the actual song like in your ears, or you watch the video and that's passed as authentic, it's kind of really funny because it's just gone through so many people's hands. It's gone through a business process.
Yeah.
So, what is authentic? You're right.
Yeah.
There's so much to that.
Yeah. Which is why I think you get a lot of, like I was talking about, the junk food rap now, because it's like, well, what can I sell? What can I put out there? What is going to market? What's going to get me more streams at this point? And there is something to be said about that. I mean, when I was doing, research, I had an opportunity to, to meet with folks like Jadakiss and ask him, like, how do you contend and work around some of this stuff with bitches and hoes and stuff? And he's just like, well, look, do you watch movies? It's like, because at the end of the day, I'm putting out entertainment, and I am putting out something that I'm now able to buy my mom a house, and my kids are owed money. And I can't knock that, because like I always tell students, it's like, somebody's got to pay to keep the light. We can philosophize all day long, but somebody got to pay for this mic. Somebody got to pay for the ring light. It ain't just going to be showing up for free. So it's like when people, ask about honorariums, it's just like, yeah, well, when I did my PhD courses, they was like, oh, $5,000 a class. You can be like, hey, $5,000, damn. Well, how about I give you like $999 and we just, we'll do it on the weekends. It's like, hell no. So there is something about the monetization and the world that we live in, which is very capitalistic. It's about products. And like Angie was saying, women are still projects, in especially within hip hop. And I think that's something, again, that doesn't get talked about enough. Byron Hurt put out probably one of the best documentaries on human sexuality within hip hop. And that was 16 years ago. Ain't nothing been done since. You know what I'm saying?
I was wondering because, and I know we're almost out of time, but it brings up a point that when we often talk about what is power in hip hop, and we think about powerful songs and pieces of that may have dealt with transformation, that deals with these issues of sacredness and you think of like Kendrick Lamar's High Power, for instance, or something like that. But also, we got to think of like the Tootsie Roll songs, songs where we can just get together and we all know the same moves, we all know the music, and that is just as powerful. There's power in there too. And so there is an opportunity for transformation even within the Tootsie Roll.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've referenced Tupac a lot, but that's a great point.
Yeah.
Yes, for good reason, for sure. But yes, does it explicitly have to say these like crazy truths about life?
Yeah.
And then, when they get rich and they live in a nice mansion, they lost it, right? But is there room for even that to be complicated? Like this whole thing of like hip hop should speak about these truths of life, should reflect hood culture, is there something within that is also a little constricting and a little limiting as well? Are those boundaries being placed on it and fixing it there instead of saying like, no? And that's what I really like about Outkast is that every album is an evolution. Yes. It's like a sound evolution. It's content evolution. The way that Andre 3000 raps, about women before Erykah Badu and then after Erykah Badu,
man, come on.
Like after the Baduism, he's like really reevaluating his relationships with women, like how he thinks about women.
Yeah.
And you see that reflected like in the music and then in the sounds themselves, like they're just being super experimental in with every album. And I just think that there is room for that. And like music, the space of the the strip clubs and like dance, so like all that being a marketplace for a lot of that music, at the end it's got to pop, or else it's not going to be passed around. It's not going to play at the club. It's not going to they're not, the dancers are not going to take it and pass it to their friends and other customers that they have, like they're just not going to do it. So it's got to pop at the end of the day.
I was just having a Call Tyrone moment because I just remember how Erykah Badu, she better call Tyrone. Like I remember what a gripping song that was, for so many people. So I just when you said Erykah Badu, I was like, oh my gosh, Call Tyrone.
That's funny.
Anyway,
that's funny.
But I didn't know about the Andre 3000 transformation, so I need to read more about this. I didn't know about this, about his Erykah Badu moment.
Andre 3000, Common, Jay Electronica.
So they all had like a come to.
They were all transformed.
They had to come to Jesus after.
Absolutely.
After
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, I think it's absolutely. Yes. All that what Angie said.
All right. I need to look into that.
Well, should we have some final words, moving in? Would y'all, anything that our conversation, that's left hanging that you want to say before we have to say goodbye?
Angie, you can go right ahead. Take it.
Well, I'm going to bring it back to, so I think that, the work that Dan White Hodge does, I think is severely like underrated and maybe not as visible to these other parts of him that a lot of people see, because he's on tenure, so he gets to see what but I do think like in the scholarly world, like I do think that he has a lot to offer. And I think in a lot of ways, Dan, I feel like you're just getting started. And I think that the work that you do is helping to really shape the way people like value not only hip hop, but just art in general. And when you talk about Church in the Wild, and we've had conversations about this, I feel like you're helping to facilitate like a generation, future generations of people who will want to experiment with things like Church in the Wild, with things like hip hop, and not just from a very flattened, reductive stance. And I think that that is the beauty of Dan White Hodge.
Oh.
So it's just my final words are shout out to Dan White
man, you too kind, Angie. You too kind. You too much. We all blush here. I thank you. I appreciate that. That's humbling. I mean, I think it's the same with what you were trying to do and put out there. I mean, the fact that you're going back, you got your degree now from Duke, and what you're trying to carve out and do with music and activism, and it'd be easy, right? And I think, for anyone just to write off or just to try to stereotype, what you're doing, and it's so much more complexity. So I wish I could have attended all those classes that you sent me links to. I was like, oh man, I so want to go to these, but alas, I was dealing with crazy students myself. But I appreciate what you have brought to the table, and and just a chance to do something like this where we get a chance to talk about it from, again, artistic, having a Korean woman's perspective on this, who understands some of those elements. And I love that, you don't have the New York and the LA connection. It's just like, no, you understand the South, and that's important, in these conversations.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Kate. I want to do the same for you now. I just want,
all the way around.
Shout out to Kate. Shout out to
everybody.
Oh, thank you. So I think the Mutual Admiration Society is on full display here, because yes, I wanted to give my heartfelt thanks to Dan and to Angie for closing us out. Like, I mean, it's beautiful that you're here with us to close out this journey, and that the two of you are so close, and then that Mike and I have become close, and to be able to have all that working here in this beautiful way has been lovely. And I'm just so glad that Mike walked up to me and said, "Hey, Kate, you want to do something together?" Like and that's that one question, became this. And so Mike, man, your knowledge of music is like mind-blowing. Going back to your friend about what's his name again? The gentleman, you're Seven Generation.
Ninth Wonder.
Ninth Wonder, thank you. Like, what? I'm thinking Seven Wonders of the World. Yeah, Ninth Wonder. Yeah, like, and you're talking about him being like
Seventh Generation, Ninth Wonder.
I was just like, that's how my brain is working. I'm like, I'm trying to connect them. And Seventh Wonder. And so Mike also has an encyclopedic memory for music, which has been so great to be a part of, and to work with you and Mike in that way, and to know how that you walk the walk, right? That this really isn't just about some kind of academic interest that you have. Like, this is something that you're passionate about, and something that you want to dig deeper into, and I'm really happy to be a part of that, and to be a part of this.
This has been an amazing journey, so
yeah.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll leave with an outro to listen to one of Dan's beats, Jamal Trio.
All right,
and we'll end with that, and we'll keep all of these, all 4 episodes, for people to share and watch, and hopefully more in the future. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all those who are watching Angie. And listening. Thank you, Dan.
All right. I'll put it in the outro.
All right.